break. 480 million years ago, a vast ocean covered our planet. Long before dinosaurs, life flourished in the deep.
Before we begin tonight, I want to ask you something small, something that will take about 5 seconds. Look at whatever device you're listening on right now. Check the time, and then before you fall asleep, leave it in the comments. The time and where in the world you are, because something happens in this community that I find genuinely beautiful. People from opposite ends of the earth, from cities I've never visited, from time zones I have to look up, all lying in the same kind of darkness, thinking about the same deep, strange, ancient things. So drop it before you drift off. I'll be there in the morning reading every single one. Now, let's go somewhere very far away, not in distance, in time. There is a number that I want to say slowly. 485 million years. 485 million. Let that settle for a moment. The oldest tree on Earth is about 5,000 years old. The oldest civilization we can trace is perhaps 10,000 years old. The age of our species, modern humans, people with the same brain you have right now, is about 300,000 years. The age of the dinosaurs spans about 165 million years, and the Ordovician period began 485 million years ago, before the first tree, before the first insect, before the first creature had ever taken a breath of air on dry land, before anything we would recognize as a landscape had ever existed, before the continents were where they are, before the ocean was the ocean we know. 485 million years ago, the world existed. It was alive, extraordinarily alive, and almost nobody talks about it. I've been thinking about why that is, why the Ordovician lives in such obscurity, why you can walk into any museum in the world and find entire halls dedicated to the Jurassic, to the Cretaceous, to the age of dinosaurs, and walk past a small glass case containing a handful of spiral shells and a reconstructed trilobite with a modest card that says Ordovician, 485, 443 million years ago. As if 42 million years of extraordinary biological history deserves a small card. I think it comes down to familiarity. The dinosaurs were large. We can picture them. We have pictures of them, not photographs, but enough fossil evidence to build convincing reconstructions. We can look at the Tyrannosaurus reconstruction and feel something. Fear, maybe, or wonder, but something immediate, something visceral. The Ordovician ocean is harder. Its creatures are genuinely alien. Their names are difficult. Their bodies don't map onto anything we see today. And the world they lived in, an ocean on the planet arranged completely differently from the one we know, requires a real imaginative effort to picture. But that effort, that reach into the genuinely strange, is what I want to do tonight, because the Ordovician is one of the most important periods in the history of life. And it is one of the most beautiful, and it ended in catastrophe. And its ending nearly erased everything. And from what survived came everything. Everything that followed. Everything alive today, including you, the world before, a planet arranging itself. To understand the Ordovician, we need to understand the world it inherited. The world it was born into, which means we need to go back further still, to the Cambrian, the period that preceded it, the period that most people have heard of, mostly because of the phrase Cambrian explosion, the great diversification of complex animal life. That happened roughly 538 million years ago, when in a geologically brief window of perhaps 20 to 25 million years, The basic body plans of almost all major animal groups appeared in the fossil record. Trilobites, worms, mollusks, early arthropods, the ancestors of vertebrates, an explosion of forms, an explosion of complexity, a moment or what looks like a moment from the vast distance of geological time when the living world transformed from the relatively simple communities of the Ediacaran into the complex, predatory, diverse animal ecosystems of the Paleozoic. The Cambrian explosion is one of the most discussed events in the history of life, one of the most debated, one of the most written about. But here is something that doesn't get said enough. The Cambrian explosion was not the peak. It was the beginning. The Ordovician is what came after. The elaboration, the expansion, the extraordinary diversification, that took the basic body plans of the Cambrian and multiplied them by a factor that still surprises the scientists who study it. Let me describe the physical world of the early Ordovician, because it is so different from today, that describing it feels like describing another planet. The continents were not where they are now. They were never, in the long history of the Earth, fixed. They drift, moving with the tectonic plates, centimeters per year, too slowly to see, but over hundreds of millions of years. Enormous. In the early Ordovician, there were no Americas. Not yet. Not as we understand them. The landmass that would eventually become North America was called Laurentia, and it sat near the equator, rotated differently from its modern position, surrounded by tropical and subtropical seas. What would become Europe, Baltica, was further south, drifting, moving slowly northward, and the great southern continent, Gondwana, the joint landmass of what would eventually become South America, Africa, Antarctica, Australia, India, and Arabia, sat across the southern hemisphere, with its southern edge, near or at the South Pole. There was no Pacific Ocean as we know it. The Iapetus Ocean, named after the father of Atlas in Greek mythology, because it was the predecessor of the Atlantic, separated Laurentia from Baltica, closing slowly, millimeter by millimeter. As the continents drifted, on the other side of Laurentia, the Panthalassic Ocean, the World Ocean, covering more than half the planet, a single enormous expanse of water, larger than all the modern oceans combined. The world of the Ordovician was mostly ocean. The land was a scattering of continents and island arcs, mostly barren, mostly red and brown, bare rock and thin soil, perhaps some simple plant-like organisms clinging to the wettest surfaces, thin mats of photosynthetic bacteria on the rocks near the water's edge, but nothing we would recognize as vegetation, nothing green that stretched into the distance, nothing that swayed in the wind, because there was no wind as we know it, no forests to resist it, no roots to hold the soil, no birds to fly through it. The land was silent, in the way that very few places on earth are silent now. And all the life, all the extraordinary, complex, evolved life of the Ordovician was in the water. The sea level in the Ordovician was higher than today, significantly higher, perhaps 180 meters higher at its maximum. This meant that the shallow continental shelves were much more extensive than they are today. The shallow sea, the neritic zone where sunlight penetrates all the way to the seafloor, where photosynthesis can happen in the water column, where the chemistry of life is most productive, was first It covered much of what is now dry land. The interior of what would become North America was a shallow sea. The interior of what would become Australia, much of what would become Europe, all underwater, all shallow, all warm, all alive. The climate of the Ordovician was, for much of its duration, warmer than today. The CO2 concentration in the atmosphere was many times higher than it is now. The greenhouse effect was intense. No polar ice caps or minimal polarice. Tropical temperatures that extended to much higher latitudes. A warm world, a wet world, a world where the shallow seas were heated by a sun that was slightly cooler than today's sun, but whose warmth was trapped by an atmosphere rich in greenhouse gases. A world that would be foreign to us, but that was, for the life that inhabited it, exactly right. The water chemistry of the Ordovician Ocean was different from today's ocean. The chemistry of seawater changes over geological time as the balance between inputs, volcanic outgassing, the weathering of rocks, the runoff from rain and outputs, the formation of sedimentary rocks, the burial of organic carbon shifts and changes. In the Ordovician, the ocean had higher concentrations of calcium, and the chemistry favored the precipitation of aragonite, one of the crystalline forms of calcium carbonate in the shells and skeletons of marine organisms. This mattered because the organisms that build shells and skeletons, those hard parts, are the ones most likely to be preserved. In the fossil record, an ocean full of shell builders leaves a richer fossil record than an ocean full of soft-bodied organisms. And the Ordovician Ocean was full of shell builders, of creatures with external skeletons, with hard parts, with the biological tools to build structures that the chemistry of the ocean was ready to support. The great Ordovician biodiversification event, when life decided to become everything. The term sounds academic. The Great Ordovician Biodiversification Event. The GOBE, as paleontologists sometimes abbreviate it sounds like the title of a scientific paper, which it is, but beneath the language, beneath the careful, measured terminology of science, is something extraordinary, something that, when you really sit with it, produces the same feeling as standing at the edge of an ocean on a clear night and looking at the stars, the feeling of something so large that it exceeds your capacity to hold it, but that you want to try. The Ordovician Biodiversification Event was the single largest increase in the diversity of marine life in the history of complex animal life on Earth. Not the Cambrian explosion, not the recovery after the end Cretaceous extinction, not any other moment in the 540 million years of animal diversity. The Ordovician. In the Cambrian, approximately 100 marine animal families existed. By the end of the Ordovician, that number had reached approximately 500, 5 times, in 42 million years. A 5-fold increase in the number of distinct marine animal families. A diversification so dramatic, so sustained, so extraordinary, that the world of the early Cambrian and the world of the late Ordovician were as different from each other as the world before the dinosaurs and the world after. Why did it happen? This is one of the most interesting questions in paleontology. And the honest answer is, we don't fully know. Several factors almost certainly contributed. The climate was warm and stable for most of the Ordovician. The shallow seas were vast and productive. The continental shelves provided an enormous area of suitable habitat. The ocean chemistry was favorable for shell building, and the organisms themselves, the survivors and descendants of the Cambrian lineages, had had 50 million years to evolve and diversify, to experiment, to fill ecological niches, to develop new strategies, new body plans, new ways of feeding, new ways of moving, new ways of defending, new ways of reproducing. The Ordovician biodiversification was not a single event with a single cause. It was the product of millions of generations, of millions of species, each one responding to its immediate environment, each one changing slightly, diversifying slightly, adapting slightly, and the cumulative result of all those small changes across all those species, across all those generations, over 42 million years, was a world transformed, a world more alive, more diverse, more complex than anything that had come before. The biodiversification happened in 3 phases, or so the current evidence suggests. The first phase was the continuation and diversification of Cambrian lineages, the trilobites, the brachiopods, the early mollusks, the echinoderms, becoming more varied, more specialized, more numerous. The second phase saw the dramatic rise of new groups that had been minor or absent in the Cambrian, the cephalopods, the corals, the stromatoporoid sponges, the graptolites, the bryozoans, and the third phase, the one that most profoundly changed the structure of marine ecosystems, was the development of complex ecological relationships between the species, predator-prey dynamics that drove evolutionary arms races, mutualistic relationships between reef builders and the organisms that lived in and around reefs, competitive relationships for space, for light, for food, for the chemistry that life requires. The ocean went from a relatively simple system to a complex, interconnected, multi-layered web of life, in which the fate of each species was linked to the fates of dozens of others, a living system of the kind we recognize in the modern ocean, but built 42 million years ago from the raw materials of the Cambrian, the architecture of an ancient sea, building a world from the seafloor up. Let me take you down into the water, not the surface, not the sunlit zone where the plankton drift and the light filters down in shifting columns. Let me take you to the seafloor, to the substrate, the foundation where the structure of the Ordovician marine world was built, the seafloor of a productive Ordovician shallow sea, was not bare rock or basalt. It was alive in a specific, layered way that is hard to visualize without spending time with it. At the very base, on the rock and sediment itself, a layer of microbial life, cyanobacteria, and other photosynthetic microorganisms building thin mats across the seafloor, where the water was shallow enough for light to reach. These mats were the foundation, the primary producers, the organisms that captured the sun's energy and made it available to everything above. On top of these mats and embedded in the sediment beneath them, an extraordinarily diverse community of filter feeders, organisms that drew in water and extracted from it the tiny particles of organic matter, the bacteria, the algae, the fragments of dead organisms that drifted down from above, brachiopods in enormous numbers, their shells hinged together Their filtering apparatus extended, creating a carpet of shells across the seafloor. In some Ordovician fossil beds, the brachiopod shells are stacked, layer upon layer, hundreds of centimeters deep, evidence of population so dense that they must have competed intensely for the space to open their shells, for the water column above them from which to feed. The brachiopods. I want to spend a moment with them because they deserve it. They are one of the Ordovician's most important groups and one of the most overlooked. A brachiopod looks, at first glance, like a clam. Two shells, hinged together, sitting on the seafloor, filter feeding. The immediate impression is, I understand this. This is a shellfish. But look more carefully. The two shells are not arranged like a clam's. A clam's shells are on the left and right, mirror images of each other. A brachiopod's shells are on the top and bottom, one larger, one smaller. The large shell, the pedicle valve, often has a small opening through which a fleshy stalk, the pedicle, extends, anchoring the animal to the substrate, or to a rock, or to another shell. The stalk holds the brachiopod in place while the shells open, and the lophophore, the filtering organ, extends into the water, a coiled, feathery structure covered in cilia that beat rhythmically, creating a current that draws water in and passes it across the lophophore, where the organic particles are captured and directed to the mouth. A brachiopod feeds continuously. As long as the water flows, as long as there is organic material to capture, it sits and filters and grows, millimeter by millimeter, building its shell from the calcium carbonate in the seawater, layer by layer, like the rings of a tree, recording in its shell chemistry the temperature of the water, the salinity, the chemistry of every year of its life, a living record of the ocean around it. In the Ordovician, there were hundreds of brachiopod species, occupying every available substrate, every depth, every chemical environment that a shallow marine shelf could offer. In the modern ocean, there are perhaps 400 brachiopod species, a tiny fraction of their Paleozoic diversity. They are survivors, living representatives of a group that once dominated the seafloor, that once was to the Ordovician Ocean what grass is to a modern prairie, the most abundant, the most widespread, the most fundamental organism in the system above the brachiopod-covered seafloor. The three-dimensional structure of the Ordovician community began because the seafloor was not flat, not uniform. It had texture, it had height, it had the complex, irregular structure that complex communities always build when given enough time and enough diversity. The stromatoporoid sponges played a crucial role in building this structure. They were not what we typically think of as sponges, not the soft, porous, flexible animals. Of a modern sponge, the stromatoporoids were calcified, hard, building rigid, dome-shaped or flat-spreading structures. From the calcium carbonate in the seawater, they grew slowly, millimeter by millimeter, building their calcium carbonate skeletons in layered structures that accumulate over centuries into mounds and ridges and walls that altered the physical structure of the seafloor around them, creating shelter, creating diversity of habitat creating the complex three-dimensional architecture that more complex ecosystems require. The first true reefs, in the modern sense, complex three-dimensional carbonate structures built by biological organisms, appeared in the Ordovician, not in the modern sense of coral reefs. The corals that build modern reefs are mostly scleractinians. They didn't appear until the Triassic. The Ordovician reefs were built by different organisms, by stromatoporoid sponges, by tabulate corals, an extinct group, by rugose corals, another extinct group, by bryozoans, by algae, by the accumulated shells and skeletons of countless other organisms that lived and died in the reef environment, and whose remains became part of the reef structure itself. These reefs were the most complex ecosystems that the planet had yet produced, more diverse than anything that had come before, more structured, more full of ecological relationships, more dependent on the fine-tuned interaction between many different species, each playing its specific role in the system. Picture a specific reef in the shallow sea that covered what is now Tennessee or Kentucky. 450 million years ago, the water above the reef is clear, sunlit, green and blue, warm, perhaps 25 degrees Celsius. The reef itself rises perhaps 3 meters from the seafloor, a wall of gray and beige carbonate, textured with the growth forms of stromatoporoids, irregular cauliflower-like masses, flat-spreading sheets, dome-shaped mounds, covered in the branching forms of bryozoans, the delicate lace-like networks of their calcium carbonate colonies. Between and over and through all of this, the tabulate corals, growing in their distinctive honeycomb patterns, each polyp in its own cell, the colony covering the surface of the reef like a mosaic, and everywhere on this surface, life, brachiopods attached to any available hard surface, crinoids, the sea lilies extending their feathery arms from stems anchored to the reef, their arms spreading out into the water column to capture the particles that drift past, trilobites moving across the reef surface, their segmented bodies navigating the complex topography, their compound eyes detecting movement in the filtered light and in the water column above the reef, the plankton, tiny organisms, drifting, feeding, reproducing, dying, and as they die, sinking slowly down to the reef surface and to the seafloor below, where the filter feeders wait in their billions. The crinoids, let me stay with the crinoids for a moment, because they're one of the Ordovician's most beautiful creatures. And one of its most successful, a crinoid looks like a flower, specifically like a lily, which is why the common name is sea lily. From the seafloor, a flexible stem rises, made of interlocking calcium carbonate discs. At the top of the stem, a cup-shaped structure called the calyx. From the calyx, multiple arms extend, each arm branching and rebranching into a feathery array of smaller branches called pinnules. The entire structure, the calyx and arms, can be several centimeters to perhaps half a meter across in the larger Ordovician species, and across each pinnule, tiny tube feet covered in mucus create a sticky, feathery surface that captures the organic particles, drifting past in the current. A crinoid feeds by extending its arms into the current and allowing the organic particles to be caught by the sticky tube feet and transported down the pinnules to the arms and down the arms to the calyx and to the mouth, a living filter, a living net anchored to the reef or to the seafloor or to whatever solid surface is available, gathering food from the three-dimensional space of the water column. In the Ordovician, crinoids were enormously abundant. Some Ordovician fossil beds in Illinois, in Indiana, in Iowa are made almost entirely of crinoid stem fragments. The broken discs of crinoid stems accumulating on the seafloor, layer upon layer, until the rock is almost entirely composed of them. Ancient crinoid graveyards, preserved in limestone, that now forms the foundations of buildings, and the decorative stone in shopping malls, and the cobblestones of old streets, the creatures nobody talks about, the strange inhabitants of a forgotten sea. Let me introduce you to some animals. Animals that lived in the Ordovician Ocean that you have probably never heard of, and that deserve to be as famous as any dinosaur. The first is Camarasaurus, or a creature closely related to it, an Orthoconyx cephalopod, a straight-shelled nautilus relative with a shell that could reach in the largest specimens, perhaps 9 to 11 meters in length. In some estimates, perhaps longer, a shell that is the length of a large bus, containing an animal that was the apex predator of the Ordovician Ocean, the largest predator on the planet for tens of millions of years. Picture it, not in a museum, alive. The shell is straight, long and tapering from a broad opening at the front to a narrow closed end. At the back, the shell is divided into chambers, each chamber sealed off from the previous one. As the animal grows and the chambers are filled with gas adjusted to control the animal's buoyancy, its position in the water column, rising when it needs to rise, sinking when it needs to sink. From the open end of the shell, the animal itself extends the mantle, the siphon, the tentacles, many tentacles reaching out into the water in the same way that a modern nautilus extends its tentacles from its coiled shell, but much larger, much more capable. The eyes of Camarasaurus were probably simple, camera-type eyes, able to detect light and shadow, to track movement, to locate prey, and the prey was anything smaller than itself, which in the Ordovician Ocean was almost everything. The orthoconic cephalopods were not rare. They were a diverse group, many species, many sizes, from small forms, perhaps 30 centimeters long, to the giants of the genus Camarasaurus. They moved through the water column by jet propulsion, drawing water into the mantle cavity and expelling it through the siphon, a rapid directed jet that propelled the animal through the water in the direction opposite to the jet, backward, as all modern cephalopods move, from the squid darting away from a predator to the octopus launching itself across the seafloor. The basic propulsion system is the same as the one the orthocones used 450 million years ago. The orthoconic cephalopods occupied the top of the Ordovician food web. They were the whales of their ocean. the great white sharks, the orcas, the animals that everything else was arranged around, whose presence shaped the behavior of every other predator in the system, and whose hunting shaped the evolution of the creatures they hunted, the trilobites. I have to talk about the trilobites, even though they are the most well-known of the Paleozoic invertebrates, because in the Ordovician they were extraordinary, diverse in ways that go far beyond the simple image of the segmented oval-shaped fossil in a museum display case. Trilobites were arthropods related to the modern crustaceans, the crabs and lobsters and shrimps, and to the chelicerates, the spiders and scorpions and horseshoe crabs. They had the fundamental arthropod body plan, a segmented body covered in a hard exoskeleton with jointed appendages, complex compound eyes, and a two-lobe structure along the length of the body that gives them their name, trilobite, 3 lobes. In the Ordovician, trilobites had diversified into an extraordinary range of forms. There were trilobites with enormous eyes. The schizochral eyes of some species were composed of hundreds of individual lenses, each lens a perfect sphere of calcite, a mineral that has the same refractive index in all directions, meaning it bends light the same way, regardless of which direction the light is coming from. The trilobites had evolved literally crystalline eyes made of crystal that could form a clear image without the distortion that non-crystalline lenses would produce. Underwater, there were trilobites that lived burrowed in the sediment, their eyes reduced or absent because in the darkness of the seafloor mud, eyes were useless, and the metabolic cost of building them could be better spent elsewhere. There were trilobites that floated in the water column with flattened blade-like extensions that increased their surface area and slowed their sinking rate, allowing them to stay in the upper water column where the plankton was most abundant. There were trilobites that could roll into a ball when threatened, tucking their soft undersides behind the hard, protected upper surface of their exoskeleton, a behavior preserved in the fossil record in curled trilobites, found exactly as they died, rolled tight against whatever predator had caught them. There were trilobites with elaborate spines projecting from their exoskeletons in every direction, spines that made them harder to swallow for the cephalopods that hunted them, an evolutionary arms race preserved in stone between predator and prey across millions of years. Of the Ordovician, the graptolites. Now here's an animal that is truly strange. Strange enough that when scientists first found their fossils, they didn't know what they were looking at. For most of geological history, graptolite fossils were thought to be inorganic, crystalline formations in the rock, marks left by minerals, not by living things. It was only in the 19th century, with better microscopes and more careful study, that scientists realized the fine, delicate marks in the rock, the thin, branching structures that looked like writing, like someone had pressed a saw blade or a hacksaw or a feather into the rock, were the fossils of colonial animals, organisms that lived in communities, each individual called the zooid, living in its own small cup, called the theca, along a shared colonial structure. called the raptosome. Graptolite means written rock, and when you see them in a piece of black shale, you understand the name. They look exactly like writing, like a notation, a series of small marks along a central axis, regular, precise, beautiful. The graptolites were pelagic. They lived in the open water column, not on the seafloor. Some species had a float, a gas-filled structure from which the colonial stalk hung down into the water, the zooids inside their thecae feeding on the plankton that drifted through the water column. At whatever depth the colony inhabited, different graptolite species inhabited different depths, different water temperatures, different oceanographic conditions. And as the global ocean circulation changed, and as the climate shifted, the distribution of graptolite species shifted with it. This is what makes graptolites so valuable to geologists. Their fossils found in the fine-grained black shales that were deposited in the deep, oxygen-poor water below the zone of biodistribution, where organisms burrowing in the sediment would otherwise destroy the record, are exquisitely preserved, and because different species were present at different times with very well-known age ranges. Graptolites are one of the primary tools for dating Ordovician and Silurian rocks from any location in the world. Find the right graptolite species, and, with remarkable precision, when the rock was deposited, they are the timekeepers of the Paleozoic Ocean. Let me tell you about the echinoderms, the group that includes the modern sea stars, sea urchins, sea cucumbers, and the crinoids we have already met. In the Ordovician, the echinoderms were diverse in ways that no longer exist. In the modern ocean, there were groups of echinoderms that have been entirely extinct. Since the Paleozoic, the blastoids, elegant bud-shaped animals that fed like crinoids, but with a different structure, different anatomy, different evolutionary history. The cystoid, even more ancient, more irregular, more experimental, looking in some ways like the echinoderms, were still working out exactly what kind of animals they wanted to be. And the carpoids, the most puzzling, the most asymmetrical, the most alien of all the early echinoderms, animals that have defied consistent interpretation for over 100 years of scientific study, because they're so different from anything alive today that placing them on the animal family tree requires assumptions that other scientists argue about in papers and at conferences, and in the kind of polite but pointed professional disagreement that characterizes the most interesting questions in science. The carpoids looked nothing like a starfish, nothing like a sea urchin. They were flattened, often asymmetrical, with a body that doesn't divide neatly into the fivefold symmetry that characterizes all other echinoderms. They had a stalk in some species for attaching to the substrate, and what appears to be a feeding appendage that extended from the body into the water. Some paleontologists have argued that the carpoids are the closest living relatives of the vertebrates that buried within the strange asymmetrical bodies of these Ordovician animals is a body plan, a fundamental organization that points toward the chorded lineage, toward the line that would eventually produce fish and amphibians and reptiles and mammals. And this argument is minority and contested, but it illustrates the kind of deep uncertainty and profound connection that exists in the Ordovician between the strange and the familiar, between the alien and the ancestral, the reef builders of the deep past, architecture in calcium carbonate. The reefs of the Ordovician were built by creatures that have been extinct for hundreds of millions of years. This seems at first like a simple fact. Ancient organisms building ancient structures. But think about what it means to build a reef. A reef is not just a pile of calcium carbonate. It is not just a rock. That happens to be made of shells. A reef is a community, a specific, organized, complex community of organisms, each playing a role, each dependent on the others, each contributing to the structure that makes the reef habitable for all the others. The reef builders, the primary constructors, the stromatoporoids and corals that build the hard skeleton, the framework on which everything else depends, the sediment binders, the algae and cyanobacteria that grow on the reef surface and bind the loose sediment, preventing erosion, keeping the reef intact between storms, the grazers that feed on the algae, preventing it from overgrowing the reef and choking the space that the reef builders need, the filter feeders, the brachiopods and crinoids that take advantage of the current focusing that the reef structure creates, drawing water past their feeding apparatus more efficiently than a flat seafloor would allow. The predators that maintain the populations of filter feeders and grazing organisms, preventing any single species from dominating and simplifying the community. All of these organisms interacting in the specific, complex, co-evolved way. That makes a reef rather than a collection of individual organisms living in the same place. The tabulate corals were one of the primary reef builders of the Ordovician. They were corals in a broad sense, colonial organisms built from many individual polyps, each polyp living in its own calcareous cup, its own corallite, and the corallites arranged in the characteristic honeycomb pattern that gives the tabulate corals their distinctive appearance. But they were not closely related to the corals that build modern reefs. The tabulate corals are an entirely distinct group that arose in the Ordovician, diversified through the Silurian and Devonian, and went extinct. At the end of the Permian, in the greatest mass extinction in the history of complex life, they never recovered because the organisms that might have filled their niche, the scleractinian corals, had not yet evolved. And by the time the scleractinian corals appeared in the Triassic, they built different kinds of reefs, different structures, different communities, different ecosystems. The tabulate coral reefs of the Ordovician are gone, not just the reefs themselves, but the entire kind of reef, the entire ecosystem structure that tabulate corals built exists only in the rock, the rugose corals, with the other major coral group of the Paleozoic also extinct also irreplaceable. The Rugose corals were mostly solitary, individual polyps, living in their own large corallite, a curved, horn-shaped cup, sometimes 30 centimeters long or more, from which the polyp extended its tentacles into the water to feed. The Rugose coral sitting alone on the seafloor among the brachiopods is one of the iconic images of the Paleozoic Sea, a single animal in its stone house waiting for the current to bring food past its extended tentacles. Some Rugose corals did form colonies in the later Paleozoic, but in the Ordovician, they were mostly solitary, adding their individual homes to the reef structure without necessarily being the primary builders. The bryozoans were essential in every Ordovician reef and in most Ordovician communities, whether on the reef or on the open seafloor. The bryozoans are often overlooked because they are small, because they form colonies, because their individual zooids are tiny, nearly invisible to the naked eye. But the colonies they form can be spectacular. In the Ordovician, the fenestrate bryozoans built their colonies in lace-like fronts, flat, branching structures with a regular pattern of holes through which the water flowed across the feeding zooids. The word fenestrate means windowed, and the pattern of hus and the front does look like windows. In a stone lattice, these fronts grew from the reef surface and from the sea floor, creating a forest of calcium carbonate lace that filtered the water, that created habitat for small organisms to live among, and that contributed, when they died, to the accumulated debris of carbonate sediment that filled in the reef structure and became limestone. The bryozoans are still with us. In the modern ocean, about 6,000 species still building their tiny colonies on rocky shores and on the hulls of ships and on the shells of other animals, still filtering the water with their lophophores, still building the calcium carbonate frameworks of their colonial homes. The same basic biology that was present in the Ordovician reef 450 million years ago, persistent, successful, unremarked upon. The bryozoan is not the creature that appears on museum posters. It doesn't have a famous fossil that people recognize. It doesn't have a common name that has entered popular culture. It is just there on the rocky shore. When you turn over a stone, a gray or beige crust with a regular latticed pattern that you might mistake for a mineral formation. If you weren't looking carefully, if you didn't know what to look for, predators in the dark water, the hunters of the Ordovician Sea, every ecosystem has predators. The Ordovician was no different, but the predators of the Ordovician were unlike the predators of any ecosystem that has existed on Earth in the 540 million years of complex animal life, because the predators of the Ordovician were working with new tools, new strategies, new anatomies, evolved for a world in which the arms race between predator and prey was still in its early stages, in which the solutions were still being worked out generation by generation. The sea scorpions, the Eurypterids, were among the most formidable predators in Ordovician and later Paleozoic seas. They were chelicerates, related to the modern scorpions and spiders, but adapted for an aquatic life. Most were smaller than a human hand, but some species reached lengths of 2 to 2.5 meters. The largest arthropods that have ever lived on land or in the sea. The Eurypterid body was armored like all arthropods, the head shield broad and flat, the eyes positioned on the top or sides for detecting movement in the water above. 6 pairs of appendages, the first pair simple for manipulation, the second pair in predatory species often large with spines or claws for grabbing and holding prey, the remaining pairs used for walking or swimming, and at the rear a paddle-like tail used for propulsion through the water. A Eurypterid swimming would have moved with a characteristic undulating motion, the paddle sweeping from side to side, the body rising and falling, weaving through the water column or along the seafloor, hunting. The nautiloids, the straight-shelled and coiled ancestors of the modern nautilus, were the dominant macropredators. Of many Ordovician communities, we have already met Cameroceras, the giant, the bust-sized apex predator, but the nautiloid cephalopods were diverse at all sizes, many species, many forms, some with straight shells, some with curved shells, some with coiled shells. The coiled shell that we associate with the modern nautilus was already present in some Ordovician species en ancien design. That has proven so successful that it persists to the present day with minimal modification. The Nautilus shell is one of the most ancient designs in the animal kingdom, still functional, still in use. After 450 million years of evolution, that is extraordinary persistence. The predatory fish were not yet what they would become. In the Silurian and Devonian, the Ordovician saw the earliest stages of vertebrate evolution. The first fish were jawless, agnatans, small, perhaps 10 to 20 centimeters long, filter feeding or scavenging, not predators in the active pursuit and capture sense, but already vertebrates, already with the fundamental body plan that would eventually give rise to all the jawed vertebrates, all the fish, all the amphibians, all the reptiles, all the mammals, all of us. The first vertebrates were small, vulnerable, minor components of the Ordovician community, easily overlooked in the diversity of the invertebrate fauna, but they were there in the shallow seas of the Ordovician, swimming through the same water as the orthoconic cephalopods and the trilobites and the crinoids, building generation by generation the lineage that would eventually come to dominate the world. The conodont are one of the most interesting and most discussed groups in Ordovician paleontology, because for a very long time nobody knew what they were. The fossils of Conodon were known from the 19th century, tiny, a millimeter or two in size, tooth-like structures made of mineralized tissue with a complex shape, pointed or comb-like or platform-shaped, found in huge quantities in Ordovician and later Paleozoic sediments. Worldwide, they were clearly biological. They were clearly from an animal. But what animal? The debate lasted for over a century. various hypotheses were advanced and rejected until in 1983, a remarkable fossil was found in Scotland, a complete conodon animal, with the tooth-like elements preserved in the position they occupied in life, within what appeared to be the throat region of a soft-bodied, eel-like creature, perhaps 4 centimeters long, with a notochord, the stiffening rod that is the defining feature of chordates, and what appeared to be muscle blocks of the kind found in fish. The conodonts were vertebrates, or at least chordate relatives. The tiny tooth-like elements were not separate animals. They were the feeding apparatus of a small eel-like creature that swam through the Ordovician Ocean, using its tooth-like elements to capture and process prey. The conodonts are now classified as the earliest known vertebrates, or close to it. The ancestors of the jawed vertebrates might be found among the conodonts, or among their close relatives, the tiny eel-like creatures swimming through the same seas as the giant orthoconic cephalopods 450 million years ago were our ancestors, or close to them, the shores of Gondwana, life at the edge of a supercontinent. Let me take you to a different place. In the Ordovician world, away from the productive, reef-rich, shallow seas of the tropical Laurentian shelf, to the margins of Gondwana, the great southern supercontinent that stretched from the equator to the South Pole. The margins of Gondwana were among the most varied in the Ordovician world. In the north, the Gondwana coast that faced the Iapetus Ocean was a subtropical to tropical environment. Warm, shallow seas, rich in life, similar in many ways to the Laurentian shelf, but with its own distinct fauna, its own community of species that had evolved in partial isolation from the communities of Laurentia, different brachipod species, different trilobite species, different coral assemblages, not completely different. Life has a way of finding the same solutions to the same problems in different places, but distinctly different in the way that the birds of Australia are distinct from the birds of Europe, even though they play the same ecological roles, are the products of a separate evolutionary history. In the south, toward the pole, the Gondwana coast was colder. The water was deeper, the light was less intense, the productivity of the surface water was lower, and the fauna was correspondingly simpler, less diverse, more adapted to the specific challenges of cold, deep, low light conditions. Some of the most important Ordovician fossil sites in the world are found in regions that were once on the cold southern margin of Gondwana. The Fezuata Formation in Morocco is one of the most remarkable. A Lagerstätte, the German word used by geologists for fossil deposits of exceptional preservation, where the soft parts of organisms are preserved, not just the hard shells and skeletons that normally make it into the fossil record, but the muscles, the digestive systems, the nervous systems, the delicate structures that normally decay before they can be preserved. The Fezuata Formation preserves soft-bodied Ordovician organisms with extraordinary completeness, and what it shows is remarkable. Among the organisms preserved in the Fesuata Formation are species that were previously known only from the Cambrian, species that were thought to have gone extinct tens of millions of years earlier, living in the Ordovician on the cold southern margin of Gondwana, when they had already vanished from the warmer, better studied tropical sites. Anomalocaris, the fearsome Cambrian predator with its grasping front appendages and its circular, multiplated mouth, was still there in the Ordovician Ocean on the cold margin of Gondwana, when most paleontologists had assumed it was long gone, a survivor in a refuge in the cold southern sea, where the warm-adapted species of the Ordovician biodiversification hadn't fully penetrated, and where the ancient Cambrian lineages could persist a little longer before finally disappearing. The land surface of Gondwana in the Ordovician was not entirely bare. The story of life on land in the Ordovician is one of the most fascinating and most difficult to tell because the evidence is sparse and the organisms themselves were small and fragile and didn't preserve well, but we have some evidence. Spores found in Ordovician sediments that appear to be from land plants or from plant-like organisms living on the Ordovician land surface, not large plants, not trees, nothing with leaves or stems that we would recognize, but simple, flat, photosynthetic organisms, perhaps similar to modern liverworts, living on the wet surfaces at the land-sea interface, in the spray zone of the Ordovician shore, and microbial mats, communities of cyanobacteria, and other photosynthetic microorganisms covering the wet surfaces of rocks and soil in the areas close to water. These were the pioneers, the first colonizers of the terrestrial surface, building the biological soil crusts that trap moisture and begin the long process of soil formation from bare rock, the process that would eventually allow the first vascular plants to colonize the land in the Silurian and the first forests to appear in the Devonian and everything that followed, the sounds of the Ordovician shore. I think about this sometimes. What did the Ordovician coast sound like? The ocean in the Ordovician would have sounded much like the ocean today, the same waves, driven by the same physics, breaking against the same kind of rocky coast, with the same deep rhythmic sound that has always been the sound of the sea. But without the birds, the shore would have been quieter than any coast we know today. No seagulls, no terns, no oyster catchers picking at the tide pools, no whales in the distance, no dolphins, no sea lions, just the waves and the wind and whatever sounds the marine invertebrates made. Did Ordovician organisms make sounds? Some almost certainly did. Some stridulating arthropods may have made sounds by rubbing body parts together. Some may have communicated chemically or through movement, but the Ordovician coast would have lacked the biological richness of sound that we associate with modern shores. The waves would have broken on a shore where no creature called back, where no territorial song filled the air, where the land made no biological sound at all. The silence of the Ordovician, the ice that ended everything how a world died in the cold. Every paradise ends. Every golden age has its catastrophe. The extraordinary, warm, productive, biodiverse world of the Ordovician ended in the coldest catastrophe the Paleozoic had yet seen, the end Ordovician mass extinction, or more precisely, the two pulses of extinction that occurred in quick succession. At the end of the Ordovician, about 443 million years ago, is the second largest mass extinction in the history of complex animal life, second only to the Permian-Triassic extinction, the Great Dying, that we talked about in the previous episode. In the end Ordovician extinction, approximately 85% of all species in the ocean were eliminated, 85% of all the extraordinary diversity that the great Ordovician biodiversification event had spent 40 million years producing gone in the space of perhaps 1 million years, or less. What caused it? The answer is still debated in detail, but the broad picture is clear. The end Ordovician extinction was caused by glaciation, by the formation of a massive ice sheet, Gondwana, as the southern part of that supercontinent moved over the South Pole. In the late Ordovician, the glaciation was rapid by geological standards, and it had two devastating effects. On the marine world, the first was a dramatic drop in sea level, as enormous quantities of water were locked up in the ice. The sea level dropped, perhaps 50 to 100 meters, in a geologically short period of time, and the shallow continental shelves, that vast productive habitat that had supported the extraordinary biodiversity of the Ordovician, were exposed, drained, turned from productive shallow sea into bare rock and mudflat. The habitat was destroyed, not by something attacking the organisms, but by their removal of the place they lived. The second effect was the rapid cooling of the ocean. The Ordovician Ocean had been warm throughout most of its history, tropical temperatures extending to high latitudes. A warm, productive, chemistry-rich, carbonate precipitating ocean that the reef builders and shell builders and filter feeders had spent 40 million years adapting to, and in the glaciation, the temperature dropped rapidly. The tropical and subtropical waters that had covered the Laurentian shelf became temperate, then cold. The organisms adapted to the warm, carbonate-rich Ordovician Ocean, were not adapted to the cold, changing, glacially influenced ocean that replaced it. And they died. The Hernantian, the name of the final stage of the Ordovician, is synonymous with extinction, with the cold, with the end. The Hernantian glaciation lasted perhaps 500,000 years. In geological terms, almost nothing, less than the blink of an eye. But in that 500,000 years, the world was transformed. The warm, diverse, productive Ordovician biosphere was replaced by a cold, impoverished, heavily stressed, glacial biosphere in which the survivors were the cold-tolerant, the generalist, the small, the adaptable, the organisms that could handle whatever the changed world threw at them, the specialists, the fine-tuned products of 40 million years of warm water evolution The organisms so perfectly adapted to the specific conditions of the warm Ordovician Sea that any significant departure from those conditions was fatal. Those organisms died. The Hirnantian fauna, named after a stage, but also the name of the characteristic community that replaced the diverse Ordovician community in the cold interval, was dominated by a small number of cold-tolerant brachiopod species and a few trilobite genera that had the right physiology, the right chemistry, the right metabolic flexibility to survive in the cold. The Hirnantian fauna is recognizable in the rock worldwide. Wherever the end Ordovician boundary is preserved, the rich, diverse Ordovician community below the sparse, simplified Hirnantian community at the boundary, and then above the boundary in the early Silurian, the slow return of diversity, the gradual rebuilding of a marine biosphere from the survivors of the cold. The glaciation ended. As all ice ages end, when the forcing conditions changed, when the volcanic outgassing of CO2 exceeded the rate at which the weathering of the New Gondwana highland rocks was drawing it down, when the balance tipped back toward warmth, the ice melted, the sea level rose, the shallow shelves were reflooded, the ocean warmed, and life, with its extraordinary resilience, its absolute unwillingness to leave a habitable space unfilled, began again. The Silurian was the recovery, the long, slow, gradual rebuilding of a world that the Ordovician had built and the glaciation had broken what the Ordovician left behind, the legacy of a forgotten sea. Everything that followed came from the Ordovician. This is not an exaggeration. It is almost literally true. The survivors of the end Ordovician extinction, the organisms that made it through the cold and the sea level drop and the chemical changes of the Hirnantian, were the founders of all the marine communities that followed in the Silurian and the Devonian and the Carboniferous and beyond. The fish that would colonize the Silurian seas were already present in small numbers in the Ordovician. The first jawed vertebrates that would explode in diversity in the Devonian, the first land plants that would colonize the continents in the Silurian and Devonian were already beginning in the Ordovician. The ecological relationships that shaped the Paleozoic were already being established. In the Ordovician, the limestone, much of the limestone in the American Midwest, the rock that forms the walls of old buildings in Cincinnati and Louisville and Nashville, was deposited in the Ordovician Sea, the warm, carbonate-rich, shallow sea that covered the interior of Laurentia for millions of years, left behind when the sea retreated a layer of limestone, hundreds of meters thick, built from the accumulated shells and the skeletons of billions of Ordovician organisms, compressed, cemented, preserved the limestone beneath your feet. In many parts of eastern North America is the Ordovician Ocean, solidified. The buildings in those cities are made of ancient sea creatures, The curbstones, the steps, the windowsills, each one containing, if you look carefully with the right kind of eye, the fossils of brachiopods and crinoid stems and rugose corals and bryozoan frond from a sea that was warm and alive 450 million years ago. The iron ore deposits of many of the world's most productive mining regions were formed in the Ordovician. The iron that went into the steel that built the Industrial Revolution, much of it came from Ordovician sediments, from the chemical conditions of the Ordovician Ocean, in which iron was deposited in marine sediments in concentrations high enough to be economically valuable. The Ordovician Ocean built the economic foundation of the industrial age in its chemistry, in its geology, long before any human had imagined what steel was or what it would become. The petroleum, some of the world's oil and gas reserves are found in Ordovician rocks. The organic material of billions of Ordovician marine organisms buried under sediment, subjected to heat and pressure over hundreds of millions of years, transformed into the hydrocarbon that we pump from the ground and burn to power our civilization. The Ordovician sea creatures are inside the engines of our cars, in the plastic that surrounds us, in the fuel that heats our homes, in the energy that powers the device you are listening to right now. The Ordovician is not just history. It is present. It is material. It is in the world around you. The deep meaning, what 485 million years asks of us. I want to sit with something before we begin the long, slow drift towards sleep. Something that the Ordovician makes me feel every time I spend time in its extraordinary, strange, vanished world. The Ordovician lasted 42 million years. 42 million. Our species has existed for perhaps 300,000 years. We have had writing for perhaps 5,000 years. We have had science in any recognizable modern form for perhaps 400 years. The Ordovician lasted 42 million years, and it was full, completely, extraordinarily, exuberantly full of life, of complexity, of the accumulated result of billions of generations, of evolution, and we barely know it existed. This is not a criticism. It is not a complaint. It is just an observation about the scale of the world and about what we know of it and what we don't and can't, not fully, not from our position here in this brief, warm, evolutionarily recent Anthropocene moment, looking back through 485 million years of geological time with the imperfect tools of paleontology and geochemistry and molecular biology and our own limited, extraordinary human imagination. The Ordovician asks something of us when we really look at it, when we really try to understand what it was and what it means. It asks us to extend our sense of time beyond the comfortable, the historical, the ancestral, into the genuinely deep, into the part of the past, where human categories and human measurements and human intuition begin to fail, where long ago stops being adequate. as a description and becomes instead a kind of vertigo, a feeling of the ground shifting beneath your understanding of what time is and how much of it there has been. 485 million years, the light we receive from nearby stars takes 4 to 8 light years to reach us, which means we are seeing them as they were 4 to 8 years ago. The Andromeda Galaxy, our nearest galactic neighbor, is 2.5 million light years away. When you look at it in the night sky, you are seeing it as it was 2.5 million years ago, before our species existed. The Ordovician ended 443 million years ago. The light that last reflected from the surface of an Ordovician sea has been traveling through space for 443 million years. It is still traveling outward in a sphere of 11 photons, expanding at the speed of light, carrying in the physics of its electromagnetic properties information about the surface it reflected from. The photons that bounced off the shell of a brachiopod on the floor of the Ordovician Sea are still out there, moving through space, will continue for as long as the universe continues. The Ordovician is not entirely gone. Its light is still traveling. Its light is still traveling, and somewhere in that fact, if you sit with it long enough, is something that feels less like science and more like comfort. Nothing is ever entirely gone. Not the Ordovician Sea, not the creatures that lived in it, not the warm, carbonate-rich water that the brachiopods filtered and the crinoids gathered and the orthoconic cephalopods moved through on their slow, ancient hunts. The light is gone from our sky, but it is not gone from the universe. And the rock is still here, under our feet. The limestone, the shale, the chert, built from the bodies of organisms that lived and died in a world we will never see. This is what geology gives us, that no other science quite gives. A physical connection to the deep past, not a reconstruction, not a model, not a calculation, but the actual material, the actual substance of what was still present, still touchable, still real. The survivors, what made it through the cold. Let me tell you about survival, because the end Ordovician extinction was not just the story of death, it was a story of survival. And survival in the context of mass extinction is one of the most interesting and most mysterious topics in all of paleontology. Why did some species survive when others didn't? This question has no single answer. And the answers we do have are often unsatisfying in the way that the truth is sometimes unsatisfying, because the truth is complicated and probabilistic and doesn't always resolve into a clean narrative of the fit surviving and the unfit perishing. Some species survived because they were geographically fortunate, because they happened to live in the parts of the ocean that were least affected by the sea level drop and the cooling and the chemical changes of the Hernantian glaciation, not because they were better adapted or more resilient or more evolved, but because the catastrophe happened to spare the specific corner of the ocean where they lived. Some species survived because they were physiologically flexible, because their metabolism could adjust to a wider range of temperatures and salinities and oxygen levels than the specialists that dominated. The warm Ordovician Sea, the generalists, the organisms that had never been perfectly optimized for the warm, stable Ordovician condition, because they had always lived in environments that were slightly variable, slightly unpredictable, slightly stressful. Those organisms had already evolved the flexibility that the Hernantian demanded of everything. Some species survived because they were small and had short generation times and could evolve quickly in response to changing conditions. A generation time of days or weeks means many generations. In the 500,000 years of the Hernantian glaciation, many opportunities for natural selection to act, to sort, to favor the variants better suited to the new conditions. A generation time of decades means fewer opportunities, less evolutionary flexibility, less capacity to respond to rapid change. And some species survived simply by chance, by being in the right place, at the right time, with the right combination of traits that happened to be adequate for the specific demands of the specific catastrophe that befell them. This is the uncomfortable truth about mass extinction and about evolution more broadly, that luck matters, that contingency matters, that the history of life is not the story of the best always winning and the worst always losing. It is a story of organisms responding to their immediate circumstances with whatever tools evolution has given them, and the circumstances are not always the circumstances that those tools were designed for. The survivors of the end Ordovician extinction were not the best, the most advanced, the most evolved. They were the ones that happened to have what the Hernantian demanded, or the ones that happened to be where the Hernantian was less severe, or the ones that happened to have short enough generation times to adapt in the available time. And from those survivors, everything followed: the Silurian, the Devonian, the Carboniferous, the Permian, the Triassic, the Jurassic, the Cretaceous, the Paleogene, the Neogene, the Quaternary, us, all of it built on the foundation of what survived the Hernantian, the first fish, vertebrates at the edge of everything. I want to tell you about the fish, not because the fish are the most spectacular creatures of the Ordovician. The orthoconic cephalopods were more spectacular. The reef communities were more diverse. The trilobites were more abundant. But because the fish are the most consequential for us, for the story, that leads to us. The first vertebrates in the Ordovician Sea were small, jawless, armored, or soft-bodied filter feeders, or detritivores, feeding on the organic particles that settled to the seafloor, or drifting in the water column, filtering the plankton from the warm Ordovician Sea. They were not impressive. By the standards of the ocean, they shared not the dominant predators, not the reef builders, not the filter feeders that carpeted the seafloor. They were minor components of a community dominated by invertebrates, by the brachiopods and the trilobites and the crinoids and the cephalopods that had been building their extraordinary diversity for millions of years before the first vertebrate had appeared, but they were there, swimming in the same water as everything else, building generation by generation the vertebrate body plan that would eventually produce everything that followed the earliest Ordovician vertebrates are known from fragmentary fossils, scales, fragments of bone, isolated pieces of the mineralized tissue that covered their bodies. These fragments are enough to tell us they existed, to place them in the fossil record, to establish their presence in the Ordovician community, but not enough to reconstruct what they looked like in anything more than the broadest outline. The picture becomes clearer in the late Ordovician and clearer still in the Silurian that followed, where the fish began to diversify and to leave a more complete fossil record of the extraordinary variety, the key innovation that would eventually transform the vertebrates from minor players to dominant predators, was the jaw, the jawed vertebrate, the gnathostome, with its ability to bite, to grip, to tear, to process prey in ways that jawless filter feeders did not appear until the Silurian, or perhaps the very latest Ordovician. The evidence is fragmentary and debated, but the jaw, when it appeared, changed everything, because a jaw is not just a feeding tool. A jaw is an ecological key that opens the entire predatory niche in a new way. A jawed vertebrate can pursue and capture active prey, can bite through shells, can process large food items, can compete directly with the cephalopods that dominated the Ordovician food web. And with the jaw, the vertebrates began their long rise to dominance, the rise that would eventually, in the Devonian, make fish the dominant predators of the sea, and in the Carboniferous send the first vertebrates onto the land, and in the Mesozoic produced the dinosaurs, and in the Cenozoic produced the mammals, and eventually, in the most recent eye blink of geological time, Produceus, the jawless fish swimming in the Ordovician Sea, did not know what they were beginning. They were just fish, doing what fish do, feeding, reproducing, surviving, but they were the beginning of the longest, most successful, most consequential vertebrate story that the planet has yet produced. The chemistry of ancient water, what the ocean remembers. The ocean keeps records. This is something that took scientists a long time to fully appreciate. The chemistry of the ocean changes over time in response to volcanic activity, the weathering of rocks, the burial of organic carbon, the evolution of new organisms that change what is extracted from and returned to the water, and those changes are recorded in the chemistry of the shells and skeletons of the organisms that build their hard parts from the seawater around them. A brachiopod shell is built from the calcium carbonate of the seawater in which the brachiopod lives. The isotopic composition of the carbon and oxygen in that calcium carbonate reflects the isotopic composition of the seawater at the time the shell was built, which reflects the temperature of the water, the salinity, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere above. When paleontologists analyze the chemistry of Ordovician brachiopod shells, they are reading the memory of the Ordovician Ocean written in the crystal structure of a shell that has been preserved in limestone for 450 million years. This is one of the most beautiful and most powerful tools in paleontology, the ability to read the ocean's memory from the chemistry of its anciens habitants. And what the chemistry tells us about the Ordovician Ocean is consistent with what the fossils tell us about the Ordovician biosphere, a warm ocean rich in calcium carbonate, productive, stable for most of the Ordovician, and then in the Hernantian, a rapid shift. The oxygen isotope ratios change sharply at the Hernantian boundary in brachiopod shells from around the world, a signal of rapid cooling, of the dramatic temperature drop that accompanied the glaciation. The shells remember the cold, the same cold that killed most of the organisms, that built those shells, preserved in the chemistry of the survivors, a record of catastrophe written by the victims in the material of their own bodies, the conodont, those tiny tooth-like elements of the eel-like Ordovician vertebrates are particularly useful for reading ocean chemistry because conodont elements are made of apatite, a calcium phosphate mineral that preserves the oxygen isotope ratios of the water with exceptional fidelity. Conodont apatite has been used to reconstruct Ordovician sea surface temperatures with a precision that would have seemed impossible. A generation ago, the tiny teeth of ancient eel-like creatures tell us how warm the water was. In the seas they swam through 450 million years ago. The chemistry of the rock tells us things that the fossils alone cannot. The carbon isotope ratios in Ordovician limestones tell us about the productivity of the ocean, how much organic carbon was being produced and buried in the sediment, how active the biological pump was. The sulfur isotope ratios tell us about the oxygen content of the deep ocean, whether the deep water was oxygenated or anoxic, whether the seafloor was habitable or a dead zone. The strontium isotope ratios tell us about the rate of weathering of continental rocks, how much fresh material was being eroded by rain and rivers and delivered to the ocean, how active the mountain building and the erosion cycle was during the Ordovician. All of these signals locked in the rock, waiting for the right instruments and the right questions to reveal them. The Earth is its own archive, the most comprehensive and the most ancient archive that exists, and we are only beginning to learn how to read it. The mountains that made the ice, tectonic causes of the great extinction, the end Ordovician extinction, was caused by glaciation. But what caused the glaciation? This question takes us deeper into the interconnected systems of the Earth, into the relationship between the solid Earth and the atmosphere and the ocean and the biosphere, all of which are linked in ways that continue to surprise even the scientists who study them most closely. The tectonic orogeny, the mountain building event that raised a major mountain range along the eastern margin of what is now North America in the Ordovician, was one of the key drivers of the glaciation. Mountains freshly raised by the collision of tectonic plates, arbore rock, unweathered, exposed to the rain and to the chemical processes of weathering of silicate rocks, the most common rocks in mountain ranges, consumes CO2 from the atmosphere. The chemical reaction between rain and silicate minerals produces carbonate ions that are carried by rivers to the ocean, where they incorporated into the shells and skeletons of marine organisms, and eventually into limestone, locked away in the rock, removed from the atmospheric carbon cycle. For millions of years, when a new mountain range is raised, freshly exposed silicate rock dramatically increases the rate of weathering, and therefore the rate of CO2 drawdown from the atmosphere. The greenhouse effect weakens, the planet cools rapidly by geological standards. This is what happened. In the late Ordovician, the tectonic orogeny raised mountains along eastern Laurentia. The weathering of those mountains drew CO2 from the atmosphere. The greenhouse effect weakened, and the planet that had been warm for most of the Ordovician began to cool. At the same time, the supercontinent of Gondwana was drifting southward, its southern margin moving toward the South Pole. And when a large landmass sits over a pole, it can accumulate ice in a way that an ocean cannot, because land can support the weight of an ice sheet in a way that ocean water cannot. Gondwana over the South Pole, combined with the reduced greenhouse effect from the tectonic weathering, was the recipe for the glaciation that ended the Ordovician. The irony is that the mountains were built by the same tectonic forces that had created the warm, shallow seas of the Ordovician, the subduction of ocean crust, the collision of plates had built the Ordovician world. And then in the tectonic orogeny, the same processes had built the mountains that would cool the world they had created, the earth, constructing and destroying its own paradise with the same indifferent geological forces. The volcanoes were also part of the story. Volcanic activity, outgases CO2 into the atmosphere. And in the Ordovician, there were intervals of intense volcanic activity that temporarily increased atmospheric CO2 and warmed the climate before the weathering could catch up. The volcanic activity and the weathering were in a constant dynamic balance with each other. The climate, the result of that balance, shifting over millions of years, sometimes toward warming sometimes toward cooling, until the late Ordovician, when the balance tipped decisively toward cold. Gondwana at the pole, ice at the bottom of the world. Picture Gondwana, the great southern supercontinent. In the late Ordovician, it is enormous, stretching from the equator to beyond the South Pole. The northern margins, warm, tropical, covered in the same shallow, carbonate-rich, productive seas. As the rest of the Ordovician world, the southern margins increasingly cold. As you move toward the pole, the rocks becoming darker, more angular, less covered in the biological material that characterizes the warm, shallow sea, and at the pole, ice beginning to form on the high ground of the southern part of Gondwana Glacier, moving slowly down from the highlands toward the sea, leaving the characteristic marks of glaciation on the rock beneath them, striation, scratched into the bedrock by the rocks embedded in the base of the glacier as it moves slowly, inexorably downhill. These striations are preserved in Ordovician rocks in North Africa, in Saudi Arabia, in South America, places that were in the late Ordovician part of the glaciated southern margin of Gondwana, the scratches left by Ordovician Glacier on rock that is now in the Sahara Desert or in the highlands of Bolivia, the frozen past, written in the rock of the warm present, the glacial deposits called tillites, unsorted mixtures of clay and sand and pebbles and boulders dropped by the glacier as it melts, are found in the same locations more evidence of the Ordovician ice, the rock record of a glaciation that happened 445 million years ago on the other side of the world from where those rocks now rest. In the warm sunlight of the modern Sahara, the glaciation reached its maximum perhaps 445 million years ago. At the peak, the Gondwana ice sheet may have been comparable in size to the ice sheets of the Pleistocene ice ages, the ones that covered much of North America and Europe 10 to 20,000 years ago, or perhaps larger. The estimates vary. The evidence is incomplete. The rock record of an event this old is fragmentary, patchy, difficult to interpret with certainty, but the signal is clear in the isotopes, in the sediments, in the striations, in the tillites. The glaciation happened. It was large, it was fast by geological standards, and it killed most of the life in the Ordovician Ocean. The two pulses, how the extinction came in waves. One of the most important and most debated features of the end Ordovician extinction is its structure. It was not a single event, a single catastrophe that swept across the ocean and eliminated everything. At once, it came in two pulses, two distinct waves of extinction, separated by a brief interval of recovery, or at least of stabilization. The first pulse happened at the onset of the glaciation, when the sea level dropped and the shallow seas were drained. The organisms of the warm, shallow, tropical and subtropical shelf lost their habitat. rapidly the reef communities, the carbonate platform faunas, the organisms so perfectly adapted to the warm, sunlit, productive shallow sea, were the first to go, but some organisms survived the first pulse. The Hirnantian fauna, the gold-tolerant brachiopods, and trilobites, that replaced the diverse warm water fauna. At the boundary, these survivors had adapted to the cold, to the changed conditions of the glacial ocean. They were not thriving, but they were there, holding on in a simplified, impoverished, but functional biosphere. And then the glaciation ended. The ice melted. The sea level rose, and something strange happened. Something that, in the context of extinction, seems deeply unfair. The melting of the ice, which should have and did eventually lead to the recovery of marine life in the Silurian, first caused a second pulse of extinction. As the ice melted, the cold meltwater flowed into the ocean, reducing salinity in some regions, changing the circulation patterns of the ocean, disrupting the flow of nutrients from the deep water to the surface where photosynthesis could use them. And the warming of the sea surface after the cold changed the stratification of the ocean. The warm surface water and the cold deep water separated more strongly, reducing the mixing between them. And in the deep ocean, the reduced circulation, the reduced mixing led to oxygen depletion, anoxia, expanding upward from the deep into the intermediate depths, where many organisms had found refuge from the first pulse of extinction. The anoxia, the oxygen depleted water spreading upward, was the killer of the second pulse. The organisms that had survived the cold, the sea level drop, the first wave of extinction, now faced a different threat: water with too little oxygen to support aerobic metabolism. And many of them died. The two pulses together eliminated 85% of all species in the ocean. The first pulse killed the warm water specialists. The second pulse killed many of the cold-tolerant survivors. And what was left after both pulses was a biosphere stripped back to its foundation, to the small number of lineages flexible enough or lucky enough to survive both catastrophes back to back. The recovery, how life rebuilds itself, the early Silurian, is one of the most important and most overlooked periods in the history of life, because it is the recovery, the rebuilding, the return of a biosphere from near zero diversity to something approaching the complexity of the world before. It is slow. The recovery is always slow after a mass extinction, because diversity is not something that can be rebuilt quickly. Each species that recovers and diversifies must do so through the normal process of evolution, through mutation and natural selection and genetic drift, and the slow generational building of new varieties, new species, new lineages. The fastest evolutionary responses the rapid appearance of new species in the aftermath of extinction still take tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years for significant diversification to occur and a full recovery of ecosystem complexity of the kind of web of ecological relationships that makes a biosphere truly diverse and resilient takes millions of years. The Silurian recovery took perhaps 5 to 10 million years before the oceans approached the diversity of the late Ordovician, before the reefs returned in their full complexity, before the food webs were rebuilt to something approaching their pre-extinction structure. 5 to 10 million years of rebuilding from the ruins of the Hernantian, and what emerged was not the same as what had been lost. The Silurian Ocean was not the Ordovician Ocean restored. It was a new ocean built from the survivors of the Ordovician extinction, with new ecological relationships, new dominant species, new community structures, new reefs built by some of the same groups that had built the Ordovician reefs, but arranged differently, interacting differently in a world that was slightly different from the world that the Hernantian had destroyed. This is what mass extinctions do. They don't just destroy, they reset. They clear the ecological stage of the dominant players and allow the survivors, the ones that happen to be there at the right time, with the right characteristics, to fill the vacant ecological space, to diversify into niches that had been occupied by the victims of the extinction, but are now empty, available, waiting for whoever has the evolutionary toolkit to use them. The Silurian gave us something that the Ordovician had not fully developed: the colonization of the land by vascular plants, the first plants with through vascular tissue, the system of tubes that conduct water and nutrients through the plant body, allowing plants to grow taller, to reach further from the water's edge, to colonize the dry upland in ways that the flat, non-vascular, liverwort-like organisms of the Ordovician could not. The Silurian land plants were still small, still simple, still confined to wet environments near water, without roots that could anchor in dry soil, without leaves as we understand them, without the complex architecture of a modern plant. But they were there on the land, photosynthesizing in the thin soil of the early Silurian, beginning the process that would eventually, in the Devonian, produce the first forests. What we owe the Ordovician, a debt we don't know we owe. I said earlier that the Ordovician is not just history, that it is present, material, in the world around us. Let me be specific about what that means. The Ordovician limestone underlies much of the central United States and large parts of Britain and Scandinavia and China and Australia and many other parts of the world that were covered by the Ordovician Sea. This limestone is not just rock. It is an aquifer, a reservoir of groundwater. In many regions, the limestone aquifers are the primary source of drinking water. For millions of people, the water moves through the cracks and cavities in the limestone, slowly filtered as it flows through the porous rock, emerging clean at springs and wells, and in the base flow of rivers that are fed by the slow release of groundwater from the limestone. Below, the water you drink in many parts of the world has flowed through Ordovician rock, has been filtered by the accumulated bodies of Ordovician organisms compressed in the limestone over 400 million years. The Ordovician is in your glass right now. If you are in the right part of the world, the fossil fuel connection is also real and specific. The Ordovician is one of the major source rock intervals for petroleum. The Ordovician shales, rich in organic carbon from the bodies of the organisms that died and sunk to the seafloor of the Ordovician Sea, were the kitchen in which petroleum was cooked by the heat and pressure of subsequent burial over hundreds of millions of years. The oil fields of the Middle East, of North Africa, of the central United States, of China contain oil that originated in Ordovician organic material, the petroleum that powers a significant fraction of the world's energy system, that plasticizes our consumer goods, that lubricates our machines, that heats our homes. In some regions, some of that petroleum began as the organic matter of Ordovician marine organisms sinking to the seafloor of a sea that no longer exists. 450 million years ago, the Ordovician powers some of our civilization in the most literal sense, the way the Carboniferous powers it in the coal and the gas. The mystery of the gamma ray burst. Did a dying star help kill the Ordovician? Here is a hypothesis that I want to share with you, not because it is proven, it is not. The evidence is indirect, and the debate in the scientific literature is ongoing, but because it is one of the most extraordinary ideas in all of paleontology, the idea that the end Ordovician extinction was triggered in part by a gamma ray burst from a dying star somewhere in the Milky Way. A gamma ray burst is the most energetic explosion in the universe after the Big Bang itself. It occurs when a massive star reaches the end of its life and collapses into a black hole, or a neutron star releasing an enormous burst of gamma radiation and X-rays in two jets focused along the rotational axis of the collapsing star. If one of those jets is pointed at the Earth, the gamma radiation would interact with the upper atmosphere, triggering a cascade of chemical reactions that would deplete the ozone layer rapidly. The ozone layer that protects the surface of the Earth from the ultraviolet radiation of the sun. Without the ozone layer, the ultraviolet radiation would reach the surface at lethal levels for the photosynthetic organisms in the surface waters of the ocean, the phytoplankton, the cyanobacteria, the algae that form the base of the marine food web. The death of the phytoplankton would cascade through the food web eliminating the zooplankton that feed on them, the filter feeders, that feed on the zooplankton, the predators that feed on the filter feeders from the top down and from the bottom up, a collapse of the marine ecosystem from the base. This hypothesis was proposed by Melot and Thomas in 2004 and has been discussed and debated in the literature since the evidence for it is indirect geochemical anomalies in Ordovician sediments that might be consistent with elevated radiation at the surface, Impossibly bias, in the extinction toward organisms living in shallow water, where they would be most exposed to the ultraviolet compared to deep water organisms that would be shielded by the water above them. These are suggestive but not conclusive. The glaciation hypothesis, the sea level drop, the ocean cooling, remain the primary, best supported explanation for the end Ordovician extinction, but the gamma ray burst hypothesis is not dismissed. It may have contributed a first pulse of extinction before the glaciation made everything worse, or it may have triggered the climate changes that led to the glaciation by disrupting the photosynthetic organisms that were influencing the atmospheric CO2 through their productivity. We don't know. We may never know. With certainty, the evidence is too old, too fragmentary, too difficult to read, unambiguously, at this distance in time, but the possibility that a star dying somewhere in the Milky Way 445 million years ago contributed to the extinction of 85% of all species in the Ordovician Ocean is real, is scientifically serious, is one of the most extraordinary ideas in the history of our understanding of life on Earth. The universe is not a passive backdrop to the story of life. The universe reaches in occasionally with its most extreme phenomena, its dying stars, its exploding supernovas, its focused jets of gamma radiation, and touches the Earth and changes the story of life in ways that have nothing to do with anything happening on the Earth itself. We are not separate from the universe. We are part of it, subject to it, shaped by it, in ways we are still only beginning to understand. The fossils that changed everything, discoveries that rewrote the story. Every few years, a fossil is found that changes what we thought we knew about the Ordovician. This is the nature of paleontology, a science built on incomplete evidence that is constantly being completed. New sites, new technique, new analytical methods, revealing new information about the ancient world. The Fezuata Formation in Morocco, which I mentioned earlier, was one such discovery, first described in detail in 2010 by a team led by Peter Van Roy and Derek Briggs. It preserved soft-bodied organisms from the early Ordovician of exceptional completeness, animals that would normally leave no fossil record because they had no hard parts to be preserved, captured in the fine-grained sediment of an ancient seafloor in condition that prevented the normal processes of decay, allowing the soft tissues to be replaced by minerals before they could disappear. What the Feijoada revealed was a window into the early Ordovician world that we had not previously had a complete picture of the community, not just the shell-bearing organisms that dominate the normal fossil record, but the soft-bodied, the worm-like, the gelatinous, the delicate, the fragile, the organisms that normally leave no trace. And among those organisms, the survivors of the Cambrian, the anomalocaridids, the radiodont predators living on into the Ordovician, on the cold southern margin of Gondwana, when they had already disappeared from everywhere else. The Sum Shale in South Africa, another Lagerstätte, preserving Hernantian organisms from the glacial interval itself. The boundary, the crisis, preserved in exceptional detail in the fine-grained sediment of the cold southern sea. The organisms of the Hernantian fauna, preserved in their cold habitat, in the rock of a country that was in the late Ordovician near the South Pole and is now in the warm middle latitudes of the modern world, the Castle Bank Formation in Wales, described for the first time in 2023, another Lagerstätte, preserving early Ordovician soft-bodied organisms with exceptional completeness, including animals that have not been found anywhere else, new species, new body plans, new evidence of the extraordinary diversity of the early Ordovician ocean that the normal fossil record had not been able to show us. Paleontology is not a finished science. It is not a catalog of known facts, fixed and final. It is a living discipline in which new discoveries regularly overturn what was thought to be established, in which the picture of the ancient world is constantly being revised, completed, complicated, made richer and stranger and more interesting than it was before. The Ordovician and us, the deepest ancestry. I want to return one more time to the vertebrates, to the fish, to the tiny, jawless, filter-feeding minor players of the Ordovician Sea, because they are us in the most direct biological sense. Your skeleton is a vertebrate skeleton, the same basic plan that the first fish were developing in the Ordovician Sea: a skull protecting the brain, a spine protecting the spinal cord, ribs protecting the organs, limbs for locomotion. In the fish, fins; in you, arms and legs. But the bones are homologous, the same bones, rearranged by millions of years of evolution for a different purpose, in a different environment. The radius and ulna of your forearm are the same bones as the paired fin bones of an ancient fish, rearranged over hundreds of millions of years of evolution, from fin to arm, from swimming to grasping, from water to land, from fish to you. The muscles that move your eyes are direct descendants of the muscles that move the eyes. Of Ordovician vertebrates, the same 6 muscles, arranged the same way, doing the same job, evolved once in the distant ancestors of all vertebrates and preserved in every vertebrate lineage, since your inner ear, the organ of balance and hearing, was present in its basic form. In the first fish of the Ordovician, the three semicircular canals, perpendicular to each other, detecting rotation in 3 dimensions, the same basic design in you as in the first vertebrates 450 million years ago. You were in the most physical, most material, most biological sense an Ordovician animal, modified by 450 million years of evolution, but built on an Ordovician foundation. When you feel the balance in your body as you stand and walk and move through the world, you are using an Ordovician sense organ. When you see the world around you, you are using eyes whose basic design was established before the Ordovician ended. When you breathe and your diaphragm contracts and your lungs fill, you are using a respiratory system whose evolutionary roots go back to the fish of the Ordovician Sea. And before the Ordovician is not just history, it is not just geology, it is not just the rock beneath your feet. It is in you, right now, as you breathe and balance and see and hear in the deep biological heritage that you carry without knowing, without choosing, without being able to separate yourself from it, even for a moment. The slow drift into sleep, what deep time does to the mind. I want to say something about what happens when you spend time, really spend time with a subject like this, with the Ordovician, with deep time, with a vast, strange, mostly vanished history of life on Earth. Something changes in the way you see things. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, subtly, the way your eyes adjust to a dimly lit room, not aware of the adjustment until you notice that you can see things you couldn't see before. You start to see time differently. The news cycle, the urgencies of the day, the anxieties of the week begin to look different against the background of 485 million years. Not smaller, not less important. Human suffering is not small. Human joy is not less important, because it happens in the context of deep time, but contextualized, placed in a frame that is honest about the actual scale of things, about how long the earth has been here, how long life has been here, how many catastrophes have come and gone, and how after each one, life has found a way to continue, to rebuild, to diversify, to fill the available space with new forms, new relationships, new ways of being alive. This is not an argument for fatalism, not a reason to stop caring about what happens in our brief moment on this planet. Quite the opposite. The deep time perspective makes our moment feel more precious, not less, more fragile, more contingent, more worth protecting, because we know from the rock record, from the chemistry of ancient shells, from the striations left by Ordovician glaciers on rocks that are now in the Sahara, that the earth is capable of rapid, dramatic, catastrophic change that what seems stable and permanent can change in a geological eye blink, that the warm, productive, diverse world of the Ordovician ended in perhaps 1,000,000 years of glaciation, and we are right now in the middle of our own rapid, dramatic change in the chemistry of the atmosphere, in the temperature of the ocean, in the distribution of species, in the stability of the ecological relationships that we depend on. The Ordovician tells us that this kind of change is possible, is real, has happened before, and that the consequences of rapid change for the diversity of life are severe and long-lasting. But the Ordovician also tells us that life continues, that from the survivors of every catastrophe, a new world is built, that the story is not over. When the chapter ends, the question is not whether life will continue after whatever changes come next. Life will continue. The biosphere is extraordinarily resilient at the level of life itself. The question is what kind of world it will be and what kind of life will inhabit it, and whether among the survivors will be us and the things we love falling asleep in deep time. Let the ocean come back one last time. The Ordovician seer, 450 million years ago, the water is warm and clear and impossibly blue in the shallow areas where the sunlight reaches the seafloor, illuminating the brachiopods and the crinoids and the bryozoan frond in a shifting underwater light that has no modern equivalent, because the Ordovician Sea was not the modern sea. The orthoconic cephalopod moves slowly through the water column above the reef, its long, straight shell angled slightly downward as it sinks slowly, scanning the water below with its ancient eyes, looking for the trilobite or the slow-moving echinoderm that will be its next meal. The trilobites move across the reef surface, their compound eyes detecting every movement, every shadow that falls across them from above, their exoskeletons glittering faintly in the filtered underwater light. The graptolite colonies drift in the current above the reef, their fine, feathery structures trailing in the warm water, a zoid in its theca, feeding, filtering, living the quiet, colonial, pelagic life of a graptolite, and somewhere in the water column, moving at the edge of visibility, a small, jawless fish, its soft body barely distinguishable from the water around it, filtering, surviving, unaware of what it is beginning. This world is 450 million years old, and it is alive with a complexity and a specificity that we are only beginning to understand. Let it settle into you. The way the sediment settled to the Ordovician seafloor, slowly, particle by particle, building over time into something solid and lasting and real. The warm water is around you. The current moves through and past in the direction of wherever the current goes. The crinoids reach into the water above, and you are here in this moment in this warm, ancien, impossibly alive, there, before the glaciers came, before the cold, before the extinction, in the full, productive, extraordinary, middle of the Ordovician, where everything is alive and nothing yet knows that it will end. This is what it was, to be in the world 450 million years ago, and this somehow is also what it is to be in the world right now. The same being here, the same aliveness, the same presence in a specific moment, in a specific place, different organisms, different chemistry, different geography, same fact of being alive in a world that exists, that you're breathing slow. Let the Ordovician hold you the way it held everything for 42 million years, before the cold came and even after, in the survivors that carried the story forward into the Silurian, into the Devonian, into the Carboniferous, into the Permian, into the Triassic, into the Jurassic, into the Cretaceous, into the Cenozoic, into the Anthropocene, into you, breathing in the dark, 485 million years from the beginning of something that has not yet ended. Sleep now. The Ordovician will be here. When you wake, it always is. It always will be written in the rock under your feet, in the limestone of the ancient sea, in the chemistry of your inner ear, in the deep biological, wordless memory of what it is to be alive on this planet at this